someone prophesy. So we see it's a language, it's for lost people, it's for it's less preferred. But what is the qualifications for tongue speaking? Well, we see first off in verse number 27 in 1 Corinthians 14, only 2 to 3 people, 3 people at the most, can speak in tongues at one time. Read with me in verse number 27. And I would highly encourage, please read through 1 Corinthians 14. It says, if any man speak in an unknown tongue, let it be by 2, or at the most by 3, and that by course, and let one interpret. So course means to be in order. So it's not like everybody's doing it at one time where you can't hardly understand. And it says, let one interpret. So number one, only 2 to 3 people at the most can do it at one time. So not normally when you go to places, everybody's doing it at the same time. But also you need an interpreter. Verse number 27 and verse number 28. Verse number 28 says, but if there be no interpreter, let him keep silence in the church and let him speak to himself and to God. So if there's no interpreter, a lot of times when you go into churches, and that's a question I would ask you, if all these people are speaking gibberish and nobody knows at all what they're saying, there's not an interpreter present, then that's not speaking in tongues. Speaking in tongues is a language, a physical language. So that's the step number one, is there going to only be a maximum amount of 3 people doing it at one time. Number 2, you need an interpreter. People have to understand what you're saying. It has to be like an actual language. Like if someone came in and they speak Spanish and they don't speak English like you do, and you're speaking Spanish to reach this people, yeah, that's speaking in tongues. It's not a gibberish language. But we also see step number 3, only men can speak in tongues. Verse number 34, you see in the context of speaking in tongues, let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. So when you go to a lot of Pentecostal churches, the majority of the time, it's the women that are speaking in tongues. I know for personally, the one that I went to, it was like all women that were speaking in tongues. Well, we see here only a maximum of 3 people. You need an interpreter, so people have to know what you're saying. Someone does. Number 3, only men can speak in tongues. That's in the context of speaking tongues is women cannot speak in the church. And then number 4, the reason is for unbelieving Jews as a sign. And it says in 1 Corinthians 1:22 that Jews require a sign. And so we see here what speaking in tongues is. It's a language. It's a physical language. If someone comes in speaking Spanish, they're speaking another tongue. They're speaking another language that we can understand. But you need an interpreter. It's not just gibberish. That's the common thing that we see nowadays. And when only men can speak in tongues, and when you look at the context of 1 Corinthians 14, and we see what being filled with the Spirit is, Brother James touched on that, all these different things. But questions I would kind of ask you to kind of end on this is just a couple questions. Number 1, do you use your tongue as a warning to Jews to repent? What do you use tongues for? Is it just to do tongues, or is there actually a purpose behind it? There should be a reason to reach unbelieving. Number 2, does someone stand by and interpret what is being said at your church? These are just questions to ask yourself. Do women speak in tongues at your church? Number 4, does only a maximum of 3 people speak in tongues at one time in your church? And these are guidelines that God has established. Paul has written that God said when it comes to speaking in tongues, when it comes to apostles. We saw the qualifications for apostles and what those were, and God confirmed through them what they would be doing.